Okay, let's talk about the last few days. The Alien Enemies Act of 1798, flights to Venezuela, or flights to El Salvador, Venezuelan gang members, a couple of court hearings, and where we're at, and where we're going, and how dangerous it is, and how this is the tipping point. This is the tipping point. There was an emergency hearing Saturday morning. A judge in Washington, D.C. issued an injunction against the Trump administration from deporting 5 Venezuelan men that the Trump administration said were members of a very violent Venezuelan gang that were here in the United States illegally. Shortly after that, Donald Trump enacted the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, which is a wartime statute that has been enacted 3 times in our nation's history since 1798, during the War of 1812, in World War I, and World War II. In World War II, it was used to justify the internment of tens of thousands of Japanese Americans on American soil. There was a second hearing Saturday where the judge put an injunction preventing the Trump administration from enacting the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. The court had information that there were planes in the air deporting Venezuelans, allegedly gang members, to El Salvador, not Venezuela, because the El Salvadorian president had agreed to put these individuals into prisons in El Salvador for a fee. They were all alleged to be members of this violent Venezuelan street gang. No hearings or evidence had established that to be the case. The purpose of enacting the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 today is to avoid due process and to avoid things like hearings and proof and evidence. I was listening to the Daily Bulwark podcast today, Monday, with Tim Miller, and Tim Miller recounted speaking with some people who were representing one of the young men from Venezuela who had been deported to El Salvador on plane loads of alleged gang members. And Tim Miller had represented that one of these young men was in the United States with a valid asylum claim. In Venezuela, this particular young man, he's like 22, 23 years old. He was a member of the arts community. He is gay. He's a member of the LGBTQ community. And he had multiple tattoos on his body that were not gang related. That young man was supposed to appear in court on Friday for a hearing. His attorneys went. ICE did not bring that young man to the hearing. The hearing was rescheduled to Monday, today. In the meantime, that young man was deported with alleged Venezuelan gang members to a prison in El Salvador. ICE had taken photos of his tattoos and said that those tattoos were gang related when they were not. So he is in that population now. He is in that prison population now. Hopefully that young man is still alive. And we saw the basically torture porn video that the White House put out showing these young men, their hands cuffed behind their backs, being bent over and marched, and their heads being shaved. They've had no access to counsel. They've had no due process. They've had no hearings. At the second Saturday hearing, the judge ordered attorneys for the government to turn around planes that were already in transit, which order the Trump administration ignored. At a press conference this morning, Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt said that even though that was a United States plane being flown by United States personnel under the control of the United States, that plane was over international water, and they did not need to comply with that court's order because the planes were outside of that court's jurisdiction. She also said that they had complied with the court's written order. The order saying turn those planes around came from the bench. It was a verbal, oral order. And she said the written order superseded that oral order, which, as someone who has been a licensed practicing trial attorney for 26 years, that is not how that works. An order given from the bench is effective immediately and is a court order, whether it is in writing or not. Shortly after those planes landed in El Salvador, the president of El Salvador retweeted a headline saying, here's what this judge ordered the Trump administration to do. And he retweeted that with the word, oopsie, too late. Trump's border czar, Tom Homan, today said on TV during an interview, he doesn't give a shit what any federal judge has to say. Multiple members of the Trump administration and their allies and supporters across the internet are demanding that this judge be impeached. There is one brand new Republican congressman, I don't even remember his name or who he represents, but I do know that he is married to Dinesh D'Souza's daughter. Dinesh D'Souza is his father-in-law, and he has said that he is going to start the process of impeaching this judge. There was a hearing today where the judge demanded specific information, what time these planes took off relative to when he issued his verbal oral order, and relative to what time he issued his written order. And it turns out that one of these three planes was still on the ground when the judge issued his written order. So still very well within the jurisdiction of the United States, and subject to that order. The judge was asking attorneys for the government very specific questions, and the attorneys for the United States government said, we are not at liberty to provide that information to you. And they also said, we are not going to provide you with these facts. That is not how you avoid being held in contempt of court. The judge has scheduled the matter for a second hearing tomorrow at noon, where he wants answers to these questions. Now, the Trump organization, the Trump administration, I think, picked these specific individuals alleging that they are members of a Venezuelan street gang, and enacting the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 to avoid the due process requirements, such as holding hearings for each one of these people, forcing the government to introduce evidence under oath as to whether or not each of these individuals is a member of a street gang, and whether or not any of these individuals was actually in the United States legally, and whether they had asylum claims or whether they had a visa of any kind. That is why the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 was enacted on Saturday by Donald Trump, to avoid all of that due process, to sidestep all of it, to simply round people up, throw them on planes, and ship them out of the country to someplace else. Trump and his administration have said that federal courts have absolutely no business intervening in or reviewing any of these circumstances or events. And earlier today, they filed a petition with the DC Circuit Court, the appellate court, to try to have this particular federal judge from the district court removed from this case. This particular judge is the chief judge of the DC district courts. He runs the courts in DC. If the Trump administration is so confident that every one of these people was in the United States illegally and was a member of a violent Venezuelan street gang, why don't they have the balls to have a hearing for each one of them and put on their evidence? And these guys weren't roaming around out on the streets either. All of them were already in custody here in the United States. They were all already in custody. And now we have the country of El Salvador willing to put these people into prisons in El Salvador for a fee that is paid for by the United States government. The president of El Salvador said that he would be happy to accept and imprison United States citizens as well, people who were born here in the United States. This is going to escalate dramatically beyond groups of young men who are allegedly here in the United States illegally and who are also allegedly members of a violent Venezuelan street gang. The Trump administration is going to escalate and expand these operations. And if you think they're going to stop with immigrants, you're nuts. All of that having been said, you know, remember a month ago or so when Donald Trump tweeted, "A man defending a nation breaks no law." We have three co-equal branches of government in the United States: the legislative, the executive, the judiciary. Our current Republican-run legislative branch has completely abdicated all of its power, all of its advice and consent, all of its oversight of the executive branch to the executive branch. This current legislative branch is not going to do anything to hold Donald Trump or his administration accountable. There will be no oversight. We are left with the courts. And Donald Trump has said, I apologize, my allergies have been going nuts today. And Donald Trump has said that the judicial branch has no jurisdiction over these issues. So we have hit that point where on Saturday, the Trump administration explicitly ignored a valid order from a federal judge that had jurisdiction over him and his administration and their actions. This also is going to escalate and expand. And we are at that point, really for the first time in our history, where the co-equal branch structure of our federal government is collapsing. The legislative branch has already collapsed into the executive, and now the executive is going to ignore or defy the legislative. In effect, Donald Trump will be an autocrat, a dictator, a monarch over the United States of America. I expect that process is going to take place this week. It's already underway right now. We are now living in an autocratic nation. And that's just reality, guys. That is just reality. That's where we're at. It took less than 2 months. It took Donald Trump and his cronies and his administration less than 2 months to dismantle the United States of America functioning as a constitutional republic. It took less than 2 months.